Hey, I'm Scott Hanselman, and we're here with John Galloway and Damian Edwards, and this is the weekly Google Hangout for the ASP.NET team. This is a stand-up. Now, the last week we did a stand-up that was more of a general overview of the project. Expect that each week these will be more like scrums, like stand-ups. So we're going to hear about what's going on in the project this week. Feel free to go back to the playlist and look at the overview or look at the great videos that we did at TechEd for a technical overview in the sense of where we're going. This will be more of a formal stand-up that Damien's going to drive. Oops. There we go. Sorry about that. All right. Hey, Damien, how's it going?
Hey, Scott. How are you, man?
Lovely, lovely, lovely. So what's the status? What's going on this week?
So there's a couple of things that we're working on right now, and from now on, this kind of format, we're going to, hopefully the intent is that we'll come in each week, spend no more than half an hour, and we'll just talk about, like what's happening literally in the last week, like a stand-up. And so there's a couple of things that are happening right now that are fairly big. They're sort of new concepts that we're introducing into ASP.NET vNext apps, which we'll see in the next sort of roll-up release, the next preview release. And I wanted to talk about some of them because they may be a little new to people in ASP.NET. So the first one is something called webroot. And tell me if you can't see that, and then we'll just forget about doing the whiteboard.
Looks good. Looks great.
Looks great. So the concept of webroot is, if you think about an ASP.NET application today, a lot of how it works when it runs on the web server is driven by the underlying web server's sort of model and behavior. And of course, I'm talking about IIS. If we think about how IIS deals with figuring out what to serve you when a given request comes in, it's basically based on a whitelist of pattern matching against the URL. So if you request your website / favicon.ico, so like that that classic sort of icon file, what IIS does is says, oh, this matches the star.ico mapping. I know that that is mapped to a handler called the static file handler, so let me just not run anything else in this application. Let me just go straight to that handler and give it the request. And obviously the static file handler in IIS looks for a file on disk in the same location that the website is rooted in, which is based on your IIS configuration, and then serves that file off to the browser, and that goes through levels of caching and all types of goodness that IIS gives you. If you've got authentication configured, that would have run first, and et cetera, et cetera. When you have a request come in for something like a .aspx file, there is a mapping in your IIS configuration that says, hey, that star.ispx sort of pattern, that maps to this other handler, which is a managed handler rather than a native handler. So the static file handler in IIS is written in native code. The managed handlers are the ones written in .NET. And there's one for star.aspx, which goes through the web forms pipeline. For MVC, when we introduced routing, we introduced something called the extensionless file handler, or the extensionless URL handler, sorry. And what that is it sits in that handler list in IIS, and it says, hey, if a request comes in that doesn't have a file name looking thing on the end, there's no extension, then let me run it through the managed part of the application if there is one at this location in IIS, and let it have a chance to answer the request. And that's obviously how routing works. And then the last thing after that is the static file handler. Now, one of the problems with doing this approach in web servers in general is that we have a mix of different types of assets in one application. So we have static files. We have things that we just want the web server to serve that have no other logic. So JavaScript files and CSS files and HTML files and images and those type of things. We don't typically need those to run through any type of code. They're on disk and we want them sent out. And then we have all of our other code like ASPX files or views, CSHTML files, and we might have compiled assemblies that obviously we need the code to run through, the request to run through that code. But mixing them all into one location can introduce certain types of issues. Certainly there have been many cases where customers have gotten burned where something gets uploaded to the website via some type of file upload capability, and what gets uploaded and then placed into some location inside the website is something that IIS would execute. So, for example, if you have a file upload function on your website and you don't properly whitelist that, you can upload something like an ASPX file to the server, and the ASPX file contains code. And so if I can upload an ASPX file to your server, and then I can request it, so I can figure out where it got uploaded to, and that's within sort of the realm that IIS is mapped to, then now I have a remote code execution vulnerability. So this, we protect against this usually by default with things like whitelisting, but it's so easy for you to add a functionality to your app like upload that kind of gets around all of that, that it's a whole class of problem that it'd be nice to shut down. Now, if we look at other technologies, other platforms, whether it be Java or Node or Ruby, they solve this in a very different way. So they have this concept of webroot. So rather than your application root, so the folder that contains your application files, your code, your configuration files, in the case of ASP.NET vNext, that would be something like your startup.cs and your project.json. This is the root of your application. This folder that you're in is the root, right? The web root would be where the web server is rooted. I mean, that's literally what it means. It means when we start IIS, rather than starting IIS pointing at this folder, the one that has startup.cs, we're going to point it at that folder. Okay? And that means a whole bunch of things. What happens then is that if a request comes in and it's for a static file, IIS is actually pointing here. It doesn't know about any of these files at all. These don't even show up in terms of IIS's knowledge of what your website looks like. And so it's only anything inside of this folder that will be served by anything that isn't your application code. So, for example, favicon.ico would be inside the webroot folder. And if you had an index.html file, a static file, or you had CSS files, they'll be inside this folder. But your project, an ASP.NET vNext project point of view, the root of that would be the folder above that. So I would have a folder here which is like, app name. So that's my project, and then these are sub or children of that folder.
So is webroot a destination where things show up? Like if I have less files, I keep them outside, and then they compile into CSS and they show up in webroot? Or do I, if I don't have less, I just have CSS, do I just keep them in my project underneath webroot?
Exactly. So that's right. So the way to think of webroot is it's almost like the bin folder for the static assets of your website. And so if you want it served, so if you have no type of pre-processing that goes on your application, if you literally just have like a JavaScript file and you don't minify it, you don't combine it with anything else, you could just store it in webroot in your project. You could commit that to source control. It would get bundled into the package, and then when you run kpack or when you publish from Visual Studio, and it'll get served. But if you have less files or you have multiple JavaScript files, you might have another folder, and we're playing with what the name of this folder is right now. But I think the working name right now is content. And
presumably you can make that whatever you want, I assume?
You can make that whatever you like. I prefer the name client, but a lot of the people in the team prefer content. Other people prefer assets. I think at the moment the template will probably ship with the word content, but I like the word client, but each to their own. But this is just source code. This is your client source code. So if you're using TypeScript or CoffeeScript, Less or Sass, or even if you're just using raw JavaScript but you have multiple files which you combine into one, that would all be in here. And then you would have some type of client task runner. So we're going to support Grunt and Gulp in Visual Studio. We already announced support for that. Then you would run that over this content, and the output would be copied into webroot. Now, similarly, if you're relying on third-party files like jQuery or Bootstrap, they won't be in either of these locations by default because you don't own the code, so it won't be in content. It'll generally be in whatever the source for your package manager is for those assets. Now, if you were using NuGet, they'd be off in the packages folder. We're going to be supporting Bower in Visual Studio, and so you'll have a folder under here, which now I've run out of space, called Bower Components, which is where Bower puts them. So it'd be Bower _
So that means
that's configurable in Bower, but that's the default. And then similarly, you would have to copy jQuery out of this folder into wherever you want it to go in webroot and reference it from here. And you would do that as part of that same sort of pre-build task runner using Grunt or Gulp.
Okay, so then that means that you're basically pulling all these different assets in from all over, like you said, similarly from taking a bunch of things from a lib folder lib folder rather, but pre-NuGet, we copy those binaries, we say copy local, and they go into bin. We're going to be pulling stuff from all over, and we want webroot to look like it would look when it's time to deploy.
Correct. So we have an example of this already. If people are interested in this approach, because this is pretty radical. Like ASP.NET, ASP Classic, we've never done this, but most other platforms that are web-based do this type of thing. Because it does solve a whole class of problem, and it keeps the separation of sort of what's client source and what's deployed content very separate.
Does this almost kind of get rid of some of the requirement? You know, a lot of people have a build server for this kind of thing.
Yep.
Does this kind of get rid of some of those things?
It doesn't get rid of anything. What you really have to, all it really comes down to is that, for example, if you were building this application, right? So this is my app.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a build server, and part of my build server involves deploying the current version of the application after it gets, quote-unquote build. Build is very different in the world of ASP.NET vNext. Then you would have to run your task runner, like grunt or gulp, as part of your build process. And that would place the output files into webroot such that when you run kpack, which is the command that deploys your web application or creates a structure that you can deploy, they will end up in the right place in that package so that when you run it on IIS, it all works the way you expect. Now, if you want to see an example of what this might look like, now, again, this is being built right now. We're literally doing the work to support this in Visual Studio so that when you control F5 in ASP.NET vNext application, the IIS Express will be launched pointed at this folder rather than at this folder. That's happening right now. But I hacked in this type of structure in the Music Store SPA application, and I used URL rewrite to do it. Mm-hmm. And you can have a look at kind of what it feels like, because I'm using Grunt with Bower in that application, and I have a build process that looks very similar to what I just said, and I don't have this folder checked into source control. So when you git clone it, there is no webroot folder. I call it www folder in my application. But there is a client folder, and there's no Bower components folder when you clone for the first time because you haven't run Bower install to restore those packages. So if you clone the Music Store application from github.com/ASP.NET/Music Store, and then you go to the command line where you cloned it and run build.cmd, it runs all of that stuff. It does all the K stuff, the ASP.NET vNext stuff to bring down the packages, to set up your machine for running the app, and then it runs npm install to get the packages, it runs Bower install to get the Bower components, and then it runs grunt to build all of that stuff so that you can then run the application. Now, we don't have the Visual Studio support for grunt and Bower yet, so you have to do that from the command line right now, but that will be there in one of the next previews.
So this is quite a change for ASP.NET people. For Node people or Ruby people who are familiar with a client-side asset pipeline, this is going to be like, oh, of course. But for ASP.NET people, it's going to take a little bit of a mind change that we need to do a build that includes client stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so right now, as part of building the support, we're obviously also debating how much goes into the file new project experience. Like how much of this do we roll into that starter template? And right now, some of the ideas revolve around having some type of content slider. So when you do file new, you can kind of choose, like, I really want an empty, and the slider goes to the far left, and all you get is a project.json to startup.cs file and nothing else. Mm-hmm. Startup.cs would have one line of code in it, which is a hello world handler written as a delegate, right? That is like the pure MTK application. And then there's a slider you could go across all the way to the right, which would then give you things like, well, I want Bootstrap, layout set up with a master page or a layout page, and I want authentication set up, so I need some pages to enable authentication. And if I'm using Bootstrap, that obviously means I have an external client dependency, and means I need jQuery, and it means I need Bower.css. They would come in, Bootstrap.css. They would come in via Bower, and then we would have Grunt pre-configured to copy them from here into webroot as part of that file new. So that if you did file new, OK, Control F5, what would happen is the ASP.NET vNext NuGet packages would be being restored in the background. The Bower packages would be restored in the background, and the NPM packages that drive Grunt would be restored in the background just because you opened the project. Not because you did build, but just because you opened the packages restore transparently. And then when you do Control F5, the grunt task that was configured was bound to that VS action by default. So grunt would run, which does all that copying and transformation, and then obviously we would launch the application .is express here, because that would be pre-configured in the project template, and your application would run just fine.
Are we de-emphasizing things like MS-Build, or are we just separating what is the appropriate use of MS-Build versus what is the conventional use of things like gulp and grunt?
So yeah, de-emphasizing is a fairly strong term. We're not telling people to change how they do build composition. We use the term build orchestration around here a lot to talk about how is it if you're using multiple things that do what you might consider build tasks, how do you orchestrate those things together? Now, if you ask a typical .NET developer that today, you will actually get very different answers. Some people use Nant, some people use PowerShell, some people use MS-Build, some people use batch files. There's really no one technology that all .NET or the majority of .NET customers are using to do build orchestration. Now, it's fair to say that almost all of them are using MS-Build at some point, because CS project files are MS-Build files, and so when you run MS-Build against that, that's how you compile your app. Now, with a K project, that's not necessarily true, because we do compilation at runtime unless you choose to do pre-compilation ahead of time. But we will support MS-Build. We'll have MS-Build hooks. In the case of Visual Studio, there is still a MS-Build file down here, which is @name.kproj, which is there to support the Visual Studio and MS-Build sort of scenarios. If you're doing ASP.NET VNext on a Mac, you won't have appname.kproj because it's only for MS-Build and for Visual Studio. So it's not about really de-emphasizing. It's about we have a new development model with VNext, which kind of blurs the lines between design time compilation and runtime compilation. It makes them symmetrical. And to do that, we had to not use MS-Build, because obviously MS-Build on the web server at runtime isn't really the right way to do it. Roslyn and a custom engine is the way to do that. But you can compose this into an MS-Build, a larger MS-Build project, just like you would anything else. Now, in terms of coordinating sort of the Bower restore and the npm restore and the running of grunt along with the compilation of your website, like the .NET side of it, we're still discussing the right way to do that. Now, obviously, right now, as I said, in the music store, we have a batch file. There's build.cmd, and that's kind of the bootstrapper that does all of the crazy stuff to go from git clone to run my application as quick as possible. We are looking at doing things like project.json supports the idea of commands, and there actually are events. So there's like a post restore, a pre-restore, a pre-build, a post-build. There's sort of those type of targets that you might be used to from the MS-Build world, and they do exist in project.json. You could hook those, and you can just run command lines. The composition model is extremely primitive. Like, you can't do what you can do in MS-Build, where you can create custom targets and do that type of stuff. All you can really do, it's more event-based. It's like, oh, ASP.NET VNext just restored a bunch of packages. Can you go and run this batch file now?
Yeah,
so it's really the limit of the type of composition we're going to add.
Yeah, it's like web hooks. It's like, here's a hook, go nuts, but it's just a hook, so be aware of it.
Absolutely. So, but certainly when you do file new, you may see that in your project.json there is a command entered that runs grunt, for example. So that if you then went to the command line and did like a kpack to package up your website so you could deploy it, grunt would run as part of that pipeline by default.
So kpack is that step, exactly what you said, of packaging everything up, filling up webroot based on all those other things, right?
Yeah. So kpack is kind of So it's kind of hard to explain, but you can run your application from source with ASP.NET VNext, obviously, because if you're in Visual Studio, you don't want to have to be packing the application every time. So you can just point IS here, and the app will just run, right? Visual Studio is set up to do that. But most people don't want to deploy all the source code to their server. And if your app is more than just one application, if it's an app plus some class libraries and as project references in Visual Studio, you want to be able to run sort of a publish step that puts all of that into one discrete file location or folder location that is ready just to deploy to a server and run. Now, this is very similar to what we did for web application projects. We had a set of MS-Build targets called the published website targets, and when you ran those, it created a separate folder called published websites, and underneath that was the output of your web application. This is a very similar concept. So if in Visual Studio you right mouse click on an ASP.NET VNext project and say publish, under the covers that runs kpack. And what you'll end up with is a very discrete, specific folder output that's separate from your source that is all set up purely for running basically in production on a website, on an actual server. And part of that is you can hook, if you want to run things as part of that pipeline, you can hook into that in Project.json, and one of the things you might want to do is run grunt, obviously, to move stuff from one folder to another, or to transpile less into CSS, etc.
So you mentioned a lot of different things happening. There's grunt, there's Bower, there's potentially Gulp, there's also all the .NET, compilation. Does this mean that my apps are going to take forever to start up? Is it, or is this kind of like some of this gets pulled in where package restore would have happened, right?
Right. So, I mean, when you say startup, do you mean, obviously, once you deploy it to the website, none of that stuff happens anymore. Like, it's all done ahead of time. But when you're developing, certainly if you, the first time you kind of clone an application and you get started, the typical workflow that we see on other platforms and what I've been doing in the Music Store Spa application is you don't check in the Bower components folder, you don't check in the NuGet packages folder. I mean, that's kind of been the recommendation for a while now for NuGet. You don't check in the NPM folder, and you don't check in the webroot folder, because this is like bin. Like, you don't check in the bin folder to source control, right? Because that is your build output. And so the first time you clone and you kind of do your build, yeah, it has to, if it's the very first time, you have to restore everything from NuGet, you have to restore everything from Bower, you have to restore everything from NPM, and if you haven't done that for any of those packages on your machine as a whole, so they're not coming from cache, that'll take a little while, right? It'll take seconds, 10, 15, 20 seconds the first time. And then you would run grunt. Now, that will be very fast if all you're doing is copying files around. If you're doing some simple transpiling from less to CSS, that won't take very long, a second. And then you tell ASP.NET VNX to actually boot the application and run in IIS. Then it compiles the application as part of starting it. And we're working very hard, obviously, to make that as fast as we possibly can. The goal is to have sort of the Hello World MVC application support full recompilation on change in well under a second, so that when you're doing development and you go into Visual Studio, change something in CS, hit save, go back to the browser and hit F5, that's basically appears instant. Obviously, the more code you have in your application, the more assets, that line gets longer, and we have to start doing more tricks to figure out, do we really need to recompile this part of the application right now? Are they only change this part, et cetera, et cetera? And we're obviously going to work very hard at that, because we want that flow of not having to do a discrete build step to be, to be real. Now, part of the thing that Grunt does, Grunt has this concept of Grunt Watch, and so you can have Grunt run in the background while you're coding, and we'll support that in Visual Studio, so that when you change a JavaScript file, as soon as you hit save, your grunt task associated with JavaScript files runs automatically as soon as you hit save, without you having to do anything. So by the time you've made the change to the JavaScript, you've hit save, and you Alt-Tab over to the browser and hit F5 to refresh it, everything should have run in those couple of seconds. So that workflow kind of works pretty well already. Then you add browser link into the picture, which gives us the ability to have the page in the browser automatically refresh when things have changed, and then we may even be able to get rid of the fact you have to hit F5 in the browser. So you make a change to JavaScript, you save it in Visual Studio, you Alt-Tab over to the browser, and the change is already there.
Cool.
Very cool. So we've up at the 30-minute point right here. We've covered not so much of our agenda. What else do you want to cover, Damien? That's
totally fine. This is a very new thing. It's a lot of new concepts, and I wanted to talk about this. We've got lots of other stuff we can talk about. We do this every week. We'll catch up.
Okay, cool. So as Damien mentioned, we're going to do this every week. What we're going to do is we're going to alternate between 10 a.m. Pacific and 4 p.m. Pacific, and that should give us a spread of about 6 or so hours, which will allow people every other week from other time zones and folks in Europe and folks in Asia to get involved. All of the schedule and the playlist will be up at asp.net/vnext. Thanks, everybody, for watching.